Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stu again, and in this video we're going to take a look at some renderings I did for a video on Red State High-Speed Rail. The concept here was that President Trump had just won the election in 2024, and Yimbyland made a post on X that, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we could convince him to institute high-speed rail by pandering to him? So I went around the country and thought up a bunch of red state high speed rail projects that were highly dubious but somewhat plausible. The first one, we're starting off with Birmingham, Alabama to Montgomery. And we're starting off in downtown Birmingham. Birmingham has a pretty cool downtown station, but the site is really not good for high speed rail. There's just not enough room in the right of way for more tracks, more isolated tracks. Here I had it down as a single track into and out of the Birmingham area, which obviously is not ideal. In order to do more than that, you're really looking at taking out a bunch of stuff. There's a whole lot of level crossings here with other freight rail and customers right in the area. It's just not ideal for high speed rail at all. The common theme you're going to see in these segments is that there's a big jump between places that are covered. So this area right here is north of Montgomery, Alabama. The distance between that and Birmingham is pretty great, but there is just no 3D Google Maps data between the two. And the whole premise of these renderings is that I'm putting 3D assets into a space that looks like a 3D space, so I need that 3D Google Maps data. Here the train is crossing the Alabama River, and then the train is going to hook around into downtown Montgomery. I had the train terminating at the old Montgomery station that is still there, but doesn't have train service anymore. The train shed is still there, and believe it or not, that's actually used for parking. So I thought it would be a nice idea to reinstate that station. Here we're flying over the interstate, and then the train would have to come down on a pretty steep gradient into the station, but I think it's doable. This parking garage right here is in the way. That would have to be blown up, but I couldn't be bothered with it for the video because I was trying to get it done fast. So the train goes around in an impossible configuration, but that's beside the point. Now you're at Montgomery at this wonderful train station. Okay, now we're in Charleston, South Carolina, and this sequence is unique among the videos because it was the first one where I tried to show some redevelopment with the Unreal Engine 5. And so I did that by running the same scene twice, one with the existing 3D Google Maps data and another with 3D buildings and other things that I had inserted into the scene. And it turned out pretty good for a first effort. That route then runs out of Midtown Charleston. It's pretty good for access as far as, getting into the core goes. It's kind of a weird little spur out there. It runs mostly under the freeway or either under or next to the freeway. Speed would not be all that fantastic there, but really you're just trying to get out of the core part of the area. There's some tricky stuff coming up here for a line where you're specifically trying to build something separate for passenger, but I think it's possible. And then this shot is north of Charleston in the suburbs, getting out of the area. You can see there's plenty of space out there to do things, and it's pretty straight. So when there are already tracks, and my idea is to put new tracks next to them, it's simply easier to render the new tracks onto the existing tracks rather than cut out a whole area and have to redo that. And then here we are in Savannah, Georgia, and this is you can see there are obviously freight tracks on the left hand side of the shot here that serves like a port facility or something like that. But this used to be the area of town where passenger trains came in to serve Savannah. There is one depot remaining still that's up ahead where we're going to stop. It's not a depot anymore. Now it's a museum. But I thought it would be a good idea to bring our high speed rail station into the same area and put it next to that old depot. So, kind of like reinstating the passenger service of old. In this video, most of these routes were pretty fast. Charleston to Savannah was no exception. I don't remember the speeds on, on any of these, but the thing about these particular routes is that they're mostly rural and pretty straight, and as a result, they're pretty quick. So, one thing about the Southeast in particular is that it's kind of an example of a place where you could get these things in place before it gets too expensive. Okay, here we are in the Treasure Valley in Idaho. That's where Boise is. We're starting off at Caldwell on the west side of the valley. The way this particular idea worked out was more like commuter rail. And this is very interesting because they're actually considering putting in commuter rail. It would be diesel electric. They're actually considering putting in commuter rail along this route. It wouldn't be exactly the same. They would just be using the conventional lines rather than trying to build a whole new high speed rail line. But, maybe in 20 or 30 years, you'll actually see trains running like this. They wouldn't be electrified, but you take what you can get, right? So, because of the high speed rail, we had some works. This is a flyover ramp coming into, I cannot remember the name of the city. I've been to Idaho, but I have not been to this part of it. So I am not familiar. There's a historic depot over there on the right hand side. Anyone from Idaho watching this feel completely justified in yelling at me in the comments. Okay, so from this stop, the routing is a little bit tortured. There's this big curve that it's a 135-degree curve right here. It would be slow. That's going to transition the routing from, was it northwest to southeast to due north. And as you can see, we're heading to Boise. All right. Yeah, this is a nice close up. This is, usually close ups like this look pretty messy because the Google Maps data does not look all that hot up close. You generally have to be about a quarter mile away, like this shot, before it starts looking halfway decent. Anyway, here's that curve, and we're going to transition to running north toward Boise. You'll notice I have this single tracked. The idea on a lot of these was that traffic would be pretty low, and this particular line isn't super long. So, in a lot of these scenarios, these red state scenarios, I think you can get away with single track line with passing sections rather than having a full double track system. Actually, that's probably the case in all of them since the areas between are pretty rural and there's not a lot of places to stop. Okay, now we're entering another big curve, and this time we're going to be heading due east to Boise. Right, and a second big curve, and then we're going due east. Okay, and you get a pretty good view of what it's going to look like across the valley. It's a pretty straight shot most of the way. This would be the fast part. I did have a stop in Meridian that was about halfway between that curve and Boise, and that would slow things down. So the thing about high speed rail is even if your train can go 200 miles per hour, it's going to take 6 or 7 miles for a train to accelerate to that speed. And then you need another 6 or 7 miles to slow down. So, in order to get to 200 miles per hour, just to get to 200 miles per hour, you need about 15 miles. And we're not talking that type of distance here. So, my logic is that it doesn't make much sense to accelerate up to 200 miles an hour and then right back down. And another thing is if you look at efficiency studies, what efficiency studies have found is that 125 miles per hour is about the sweet spot for efficiency on electric trains. And that has to do with things like wind resistance and just the amount of energy. I don't want to say it goes up exponentially. It probably goes up logarithmically. But the amount of energy that you consume after a certain point exceeds the amount of time that you save over 125 miles per hour. And so 125 miles per hour is a pretty good speed for electric rail as far as efficiency goes. And so if in that 15 miles you can spend 8 miles getting up to 125 miles per hour and back down to zero, and then cruise for 7, you get there in almost the same amount of time as if you'd gone all the way up to 200, but you use less energy. So that was a very long-winded explanation of why in some of these videos my idea is that rather than accelerating to as fast as you can get and then slowing right back down, you would probably want to plateau a little bit. All right, now we're coming into the Boise area, and there's one last big curve. It would be pretty slow here. And then you come into Boise's pretty awesome Mission Revival station that looks like something straight out of California. Why this is in Idaho, I do not know, but it's an awesome looking station. I would like to visit it one day. That would be pretty cool. And overall, that was a lot like commuter rail. I think I had it averaging something like 55 miles per hour. Let's see if they actually build it. I think it might be pretty cool to see if Idaho actually builds something like that. Okay, up next is the Wildcat Express. This is Kentucky. We're running rail from Louisville to Lexington via Frankfort, the capital. Starting off kind of on the east side of the downtown area, it's nearly impossible to get a new train line into downtown Louisville. It's just a tangle of freeways. It would be really difficult to do. So we're starting on the east side near the soccer stadium. Then we go over the Spaghetti. This is called Spaghetti Junction in the area. It's this messy, crazy freeway junction they've got out there. And the reason for that is in the video explains their Interstate 64 is kind of the better route to get out of the area, but there is a tunnel over a park that you can't demolish, so you can't use Interstate 64 for this purpose. So in the video, we went around a little bit. Now we do end up back on Interstate 64 eventually. That's where we are now. And this is just showing how, Interstate 64 is pretty straight in parts. And so, this train could get pretty fast, even though it's fairly suburban out in that area. This line, now we're coming into the Lexington area because Frankfort didn't have any 3D Google Maps data. The thing about Kentucky is, unless you're from Kentucky, you probably don't imagine that it's all that suburban. But this particular 80 miles between Louisville and Lexington Actually does have quite a bit of suburban development, so it's one of the least rural routes in this video. All right, so we're coming into Lexington. We made a big curve off the freeway onto the rail right away, and then coming into an area between University of Kentucky and downtown Lexington. I thought it was a good compromise spot. I think it would work out really well. This particular route ended up being the cheapest per person in the metropolitan areas featured. So if you are going to see high speed rail out of all these concepts, Kentucky might be the most likely. This is Little Rock, Arkansas, and it's not the first time that I've been to Little Rock, Arkansas in a video. The first time was routing from Dallas, Texas to Little Rock as part of the Southeast High Speed Rail Corridor. Little Rock has its Union Station pretty close to downtown, right by the state capitol, which you can see in the background. This is a fairly conveniently located station, but it does have one problem. Straight out to the north, you have to go over the Arkansas River. And in this case, if you're trying to add a couple of new tracks, that becomes a challenge, because right after you get over the river, you're going to have to rise up and get over a rail yard that's right there. So here we are crossing the Arkansas River on a new bridge. That would also have to be movable. There's just no way to get enough clearance otherwise. And then over the rail yard on a viaduct. And there is real world precedent for this. California High Speed Rail, in its recently released LA to Anaheim documents, has something very similar to this through the rail yard at Hobart. And then another Google 3D Maps data jump straight to Memphis. There's nothing in between on the data. For this, I elected to put a new bridge over the Mississippi, about 5 miles north of town, just because getting to the existing station would have been difficult. And also, if you go this route, it gives you the opportunity to put a station at the Bass Pro Shops Pyramid. And of course, we want that. So there it is in all its glory. I don't see how you put your train at the existing train station if you have the ability to put it here at the Pyramid instead in Memphis. All right, now here we are in North Dakota. And North Dakota is going to be Fargo to Grand Forks. And Fargo is not super easy to get a couple of new tracks into the center of the city, so I elected to go with the International Airport a little north of town. It's still pretty close, so I don't think it would be all that inconvenient of a place to disperse from. The way it works out there is you have a couple of options between the two cities. You have freight rail and Interstate 29, I believe it is. And both are not bad. Interstate 29 has a couple of curves on the southern portion, so I elected to go with freight rail in that instance because it's just a little bit faster. The freight rail is very straight out there. As you can see, there are not a lot of natural obstacles to worry about. It's pretty flat. One problem with freight rail in a lot of rural areas is that since it was laid down before the age of the automobile, you get a lot of towns every 5 or 10 miles that spring up around the tracks that pose a problem. That becomes an issue on this routing at a certain point, and so I transitioned to the interstate. You can see the interstate right away has plenty of room for a couple of electrified tracks. You probably have 80 feet of right of way right there between lanes and other properties. So here we're coming into Grand Forks, and the approach to Grand Forks is straightforward. There's just really nothing there. You just next to the freeway, go over some existing roads on some ramps. It's not all that complicated. Like Fargo, getting into the center of Grand Forks is a challenge, so I went ahead and took the easy way out and put the station next to the interstate at Alerus Center. This is an arena for, I believe it's University of North Dakota, which is not far away. And so it seemed like a decent place. They have a lot of surface parking out there. There are a lot of properties around there that could be redeveloped. So I was thinking, okay, put it here and put in some mixed use development and you're done. That points out kind of the difference between engineering challenges and political challenges, because I think if you plan to do that, you would have people who own businesses in downtown who wouldn't be a fan of that idea. They'd rather have it in downtown. But this is not the real world. This is a fake 3D space, and I get to do what I want in it. Now we are in Nebraska, and this is a line that's going to run from Lincoln to Omaha. We're currently in Lincoln at the Amtrak station there. Lincoln is the home of the University of Nebraska Huskers. As you can see, there's extensive rail in the area already, and of course that poses a challenge because where are you going to fit a couple of new tracks? So in a lot of these videos, the idea was when things get tight, we'll just shrink down to one track because the traffic won't be that heavy anyway. And so I had one track going through there. There is enough room in a lot of these videos. Rather than remove a bunch of stuff and try to squeeze the new track in, I'll just lay it on top of an existing track out of convenience. Some compromises here would be like at grade through this rail yard. So obviously you're looking at some speed compromises on the ends, but you get to a point where you can go a little bit faster. Like right here, hey. So whenever a route gets up to top speed, usually 200 miles per hour, I like to put it in a video just to show what it would be like to be cruising through the Nebraska countryside at 200 miles per hour. And this is another instance where I put the tracks on existing tracks, but it would actually go next to it. And then we've jumped ahead a little bit to the suburbs of Omaha, where we're next to the freeway now and a little bit slower. This isn't quite 200 miles per hour, just because the geometry of the freeway doesn't support that. But I think it was still about 125 here. And that's cruising along into the heart of Omaha. And, this is another instance where it's not going to be super fast in Omaha. You're going to have to move some freight tracks, but it'll all fit. And it will get you access. Access is what you're looking for at the ends. Super fast is in between. As long as you don't waste too much time on the access, it ends up working out. And then in Omaha, we come into this station that needed some curved platforms because otherwise it just wasn't long enough without destroying stuff. And, that's pretty close to downtown. It's right on the edge. Pretty convenient. I think it would work out. Now we're in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, of course. This is also a little bit of a retread from Southeast High Speed Rail. The first video I did for that was San Antonio, Texas to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in this section here, we're going to redo Oklahoma City to Tulsa. The theme on this video, of course, was states that voted for Donald Trump for president in 2024, and routes within those. Well, Oklahoma was one of them, and Oklahoma City to Tulsa is about the only route in the state that makes any sense. So, because of that, I borrowed some renderings from that Southeast High Speed Rail video, like this one, where we're flying over from freight rail right of way into the Interstate 344 right of way on a big convoluted flyover ramp. But that's what you got to do sometimes. Pretty slow right here, but then that transitions pretty quickly into Interstate 44, which we'll see in just a second. And here it is, Interstate 44. This is one of the better suited interstates in the country for this purpose. It is generally quite fast. Where it is not perfect, there's plenty of land to smooth it out. So it's 107 miles between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and I think I had that taking something like 40 or 45 minutes, which would make it one of the faster possible high-speed rail lines in the country. Coming into the Tulsa area gets a little complicated because you've got a freeway that's not great for the purpose. You've got a freight rail right of way that has a lot of crossings. There is room next to the freight rail right of way, but in order to make that work, you got to go with a long viaduct. So I did. And then into Tulsa, what I concluded was getting into downtown Tulsa was more or less impossible on the surface without just destroying a lot of stuff. So I elected for a tunnel. Tunnel under the river. And which river is that? Red River? I don't remember the rivers. But anyway, you go under the river and through the woods to Grandma's house under Tulsa, Oklahoma. Next up, we have West Virginia, and the city pair for West Virginia was Charleston, which is the state capital, and Huntington, which, if I remember correctly, is the second largest city in West Virginia. Most of West Virginia's population lives in the western part of the state, and most of that is people living in the river valleys that are carved out from the otherwise very hilly terrain. As you can see, these river valleys are not terribly wide, and because of that, this would be a very challenging place to try to insert high-speed rail. Here in Charleston, we're going single-tracked because there just isn't a lot of room, and also in a pairing like this, you wouldn't have a lot of traffic, so single-tracked with some passing sections is perfectly fine. This would continue on the northern side of the river here in the Charleston area until crossing over eventually. And then I had that heading into a 10-mile long tunnel that came out about halfway between the two cities. That joined up with Interstate 64 and then eventually jumped out of Interstate 64 and into freight rail right of way into Huntington here. You can see there isn't a ton of room next to the freight rail right of way here, but there is just enough for a single track. And so that is possible. As with other videos, I went ahead and put the track on existing tracks, but there is room for a single electrified track next to this without taking out too many properties or having to consume too much land from existing properties. You can see they're running some pretty long coal trains in the area. So speed's going to be slow here due to safety concerns. No big deal. You know, as we've talked about in other sections, the main idea with these slow parts on the ends is access, and then your parts in between would be faster. I had the in-between part running between about 135 and 150 miles per hour. So this maybe would be better suited as like a 125 mile per hour line if you did something like that, and then you could do it diesel electric. It will probably never happen either way. The station is on the wrong side of the tracks from downtown, but the right side of the tracks is kind of impossible for this particular type of concept. So my idea there was that you've got grade separated roads on either end, so you could run bus service to the downtown area or something like that. Okay, now we're in Wyoming. And Wyoming was the last portion of the video because this had the highest percentage of Trump voters in the 2024 election. It's also last in this video because it's the last alphabetically. Kind of the idea put forth in the video was that what might make sense for Cheyenne, Wyoming here is that connecting it to Fort Collins, Colorado, which would be part of like a front range high speed rail thing. However, in 2024, Kamala Harris won Colorado, so there goes that idea. So instead, we're going to go ahead and connect Cheyenne, Wyoming to Casper, Wyoming, which is the second largest city in Wyoming. Kind of the same thing. There's a lot of rural empty space between the two cities. Big surprise. So there isn't much to show other than the two cities. So we jump straight from Cheyenne to Casper. That's mostly following the freeway, which has its challenges, but is pretty fast. And once you get off the freeway in Casper, there's an old freight rail right of way that has been converted into rails to trails, and I went ahead and converted it back. So that portion would be pretty slow just because you're not going to be able to grade separate it, but it's also a really short section. So overall, this line would still be super fast. I had the station site where a used car lot is currently. That's about a block away from downtown. So in terms of location, it's a good location. The city pair is a dumb idea. It worked out to something like $50,000 a person. So this will never ever happen. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this look at red state high speed rail pairs with various amounts of plausibility. Something like Kentucky seems like it is reasonable. Something like Wyoming will never ever happen. Anyway, that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you on that big, beautiful freeway.